Okay, so risk analysis is divided into three main topics. We have risk assessment, which is what I'm going to go into a little bit of detail about, risk communication, and risk management. And although you might think this doesn't apply to you, I think that you're doing a lot of risk communication and a lot of risk management and a lot of risk assessment in your roles and in your food practices every single day. So the next couple of slides are actually ones I put together from a presentation many years ago for what we do, and you can see that a lot of it is the same. So in terms of risk management activities, the only slide that I changed on this to apply to this talk is in gray. It says suspend or cancel a contract with a supplier. If you were to find a problem in your operation and someone was sending you sub-quality product, this is an example of a typical risk management activity that you might undergo. Conduct staff training. We have to do the same thing. You might do inspections of your facility or components of your facility. You review your documents. You might increase or request more product testing if you're looking to find a problem or just monitor your operation. And then both Scott and Steve talked about mock recalls. That's another risk management activity that you might undertake. And then you also might have to detain or order some product destruction, just as was covered now. So even though you might not think about the activities you're doing as being risk management, you're probably engaging in them almost every day. And then for risk communication, again, you're amending your standard operating practices, or you're creating sanitation SOPs. You're sometimes talking to media, either promoting your business or addressing an issue. I've got a smiley face by the next one. Sometimes you're giving a lecture or you're giving a talk to your colleagues. This is risk communication. You could be developing your website, and then you're perhaps suggesting new policy or new direction and informing your stakeholders. This is really important. You're informing your consumers, you're engaging with other industry, and of course you're engaging with regulators. And you can do this through a variety of means, a lot of social media. So what do I mean by risk communication? Oh, I've been dying to use these slides that I've snapped over the last few months. So I take the bus to work quite a lot, and we get the free Star Metro, and we saw this, the fall of the Romaine Empire. I thought it was very cute, very snappy. And just a few months ago, I was shopping at Save On Foods, and this sign was up. Now, I'm not sure if Save On Foods created this independently or if they had information from one of the suppliers, but I thought this was great. Remain calm. There's lettuce out there if you want to make your Caesar salad. Did it change my buying decision? Actually, it did that day, but I would have preferred more information. What I wanted it to say is, it says, on this, it says it's not sourced from the regions that are affected by the most recent advisory and recall. I wanted it to say, this lettuce isn't from Salinas Valley, California, it's from the Fraser Valley. That would have made me feel a lot happier. And as a consumer, that's what I want to see. So lately, I've actually been seeing a lot of pre-washed lettuce products that say made in BC, and I've been buying those as a consumer because I have a lot more faith in our industry than in a lot of things that are imported. So I really think it's important to provide really good traceability. So I'm going to talk a lot about risk assessment, but all of these things that are going to show up in this one slide, don't worry. There's not going to be a quiz at the end, but I am going to ask you some questions. So when we do a risk assessment on any kind of food process or any health risk event, we start off by collecting background information. So the first thing we're going to ask is, with this food, is there a history of foodborne illness? Because if there isn't, then you might have something else going on. There could be, but that's the first important question. Well, how do we find out if there's a history? You review the literature. And that's not hard to do anymore now that we have Google. You can just go to Google Scholar, type in a couple keywords, and a whole bunch of stuff will pop up for you. So that's the only top two there that I want to cover. But I also think for you guys, it's important to review your Canada Gap checklist. I think there's a lot of great information in there, and we'll be going through a few things towards the end. So in terms of growth practices, are you getting your materials from an approved supplier, an approved food source? The other thing that I really wanted to point out in this list, other than, you all know the 3 hazards that you identify in your products, right? Biological, chemical, physical. That's very standard, very basic stuff. But some of the intrinsic factors associated with the food, that's what we look at. So a food is identified as potentially hazardous if the pH is above 4.6 or if the water activity is above 0.85. This is all basic stuff, right? Okay. We'll talk about pH some more. So pH is the acidic scale. So if things are below 4.6, they're very acidic, and above 4.6, they're more alkaline. And then in the third column here, if you look at the examine handling, transport, and distribution, have you identified and assessed all the food handling practices that contribute to your risk? And then finally, you really want to identify your evidence, evaluate it, and see if there's enough hurdles. And one of the things you can look at is your lab tests. So if you're in a processing facility, you probably have quality control, quality assurance standards, and you can assess your lab results there. So this next chart, I know some of the acronyms on the bottom left there are a bit old. It was done over a decade ago now. But what I wanted to point out here is that in terms of the produce supply chain, you can see in red, these are where potential hazards might occur. B stands for biological, C stands for chemical, and P stands for physical. And then in the green, that's where you can actually control them. So a lot of the control does happen right at the farm level. So you can also do other controls throughout the food chain, but it's really important to note that a lot of these hazards or issues that you have can be controlled right at the first step, right on the farm. And these are the ones that I want to talk about more today. So I'm next going to say how we try to do it. This is how we try to do food risk assessment, and this comes right out of a food recall manual that we created for ourselves. So just following along the top, first we have a health risk event. This could be anything. This could just be a consumer complaint. It could be a finding on an inspection that someone has done. It could be a result back from the lab. And then, so following along, the next thing is, what kind of communication do we need to know? Who do we need to inform right now? And maybe get a little meeting going, set up a conference call, find out whose roles or who we have to bring into the discussion. That's important to do right away. And then the next thing is to do a risk assessment. And at this stage, you don't want to take action too soon. You want to get your facts straight, but you do want to hold things. If you have product that you're not sure needs to be recalled, just hold it. With some types of produce that might be time sensitive, so you do need to act quickly, but it is important to get the information you need to make an informed decision. That's what we really want to do here. So I'll go into that a little bit more later, how we do this. But then the next thing is to determine the priority level. For us, it's risk to public health. Is this a low risk? Has there been illnesses identified? If that's the case, it's a much higher risk. And then you take your actions. And then at the end of it, it's always important to tell people, stand down, we figured it out. So if you figured it out, you have to make sure you communicate to everyone else that the problem has been dealt with, or there's actually no action that needs to be taken. So I'm going to give a little example that actually occurred a couple of months ago. And we were actually contacted by the Food Banks BC. They had purchased several tens of thousands of dollars of milk that they then wanted to distribute to some key food banks across BC. Now, they had intended to purchase milk that was room temperature stable. And when they purchased it and transported it in a truck, it was transported at room temperature. But when it came to the food banks, on the outside of the boxes and on the milk cartons, it clearly said keep refrigerated. So they were really concerned that this product was no longer able to be used and it would have to be thrown out. So one of the first things they did was call me and said, "Oh, Lorraine, what can we do? Can you help us?" And I asked them to communicate with all the food banks to say, okay, put all of this milk on hold and put it in their fridge. And please tell them, don't take any action, don't throw it out until we do an investigation. And that's what we did. We got some samples and sent them to our lab. But the most important thing we did was to reach out to you. We reached out to the company that manufactured the milk. And it turns out that it was actually UHT milk, so ultra high pasteurized filtered milk. But in order to preserve, or in order to get the best quality out of the milk, the best taste, they do prefer it's refrigerated. Most people like to drink refrigerated milk here. So we got information back from the company, shared it with the director of Food Banks BC, and she was able to tell all of her clients, yes, this milk is safe. And our labs back from the results showed 0, 0, 0, no coliforms, no E. coli, everything was fine. But that first trigger or panic that you feel, don't take action. Just wait, do your risk assessment, get the facts you need, and then you can make an informed decision. So after it was all over, we obviously thanked the company, but we also had the food bank let everyone else know, yes, the milk is safe. It's safe to serve your clients. So that's how we handle health risk events. So when it comes to foodborne illness, this is the risk matrix we use. This, again, is out of our recall manual. We only have a few questions, the really top questions that are important to us. The first one is, and this fits into traceability, can the consumer identify the recalled product based on the photo or the label or where it was purchased? So if it was, I don't know, I'm trying to think of an example here, but if there was a problem, I'll go back. Does anyone remember the history of melons and aldicarb? It's a really, really old one, but I think that was in the 80s. There were a number of people that phoned the Poison Control Center, and all they knew was that they ate melons, but there were no stickers or labels to say what it was. So when we're evaluating whether or not to do a public advisory, we base it on whether consumers can identify it. It's really important. If consumers can't identify the product they ate, we're less likely to do a consumer advisory. It's really important to have that identification and traceability. The other one is how much product is available at retail. And again, this is based on your traceability. So if you can tell us that, well, yeah, some of it went out to distribution, but in fact, from the supplier or from the distributor, we were able to detain 90% of it, the risk is much lower. Does the food have a long shelf life? So one of my examples later is going to be flour. We're really worried about things like flour because it can sit in people's cupboards for years. If it has the ability to stay around longer, it increases the risk. Is it contaminated with a pathogen? Well, this will be based on lab testing, right? And then does it exceed the prescribed standard for safety? So if you're not supposed to have E. coli, or if you have 1,000 MPN or something, if your numbers are too high, yeah, the risk increases again. And then the most important one is, are there any illnesses related to food? So what we do is we add up all the numbers in this little simple chart, and if it's 10 or more, we're much more likely to issue a public advisory. Okay, so how do we avoid this? This is where I'm going to talk about the cantaloupe and the flour and the underlying reasons for it. And I'm going to try to get you to think about those food operations from a risk assessment perspective. But I'm not an agriculture person, so you have to be kind to me on this one. So we're going to talk about cantaloupe. I was really trying to get a picture of cantaloupe grown in Grand Forks because my parents lived there, and that was the best cantaloupe I've ever eaten. Anyways, it's grown on a hillside under black tarp. I really like that cantaloupe. The stuff we get in the stores here, it just doesn't taste as good. So we're going to do some risk assessment. So the first question I'm asking you, and I really do want someone to shout out if you know the answer, is there any history of foodborne illness with this fruit? I see some heads. Yes, 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 there is. Okay, it's not just one thing though. There's many things: Listeria, Salmonella, norovirus, E. coli, Campylobacter. How did I find this out? It took me about 30 seconds to Google, and I came up with this paper. And in fact, you can see in the first two columns, these are the fruits that they had in this particular paper. And this only goes up to 2011, but there's been a number of different outbreaks with this particular fruit. So yes, it is hazardous or potentially hazardous for carrying these kinds of issues. Salmonella, norovirus, Campylobacter, aldicarb. That's probably why I was thinking of that. Yeah, so it was probably involved in that initial recall back in the 80s. Okay, next question. Or I'll talk a little bit about this outbreak some more. This is the biggie that you probably remember that happened in Colorado in Jensen Farms. Why is this important? Yeah, there's been a number of illnesses. There were over 147 in the US, 33 deaths, a lot of hospitalizations. These brothers actually ended up getting a fine of $150,000, and they served community service. This was a really big deal, very unfortunate. So why was cantaloupe such an issue? This is the risk assessment. This is what you have to drill down to in whatever product you have. What makes it a vehicle to carry all of these different pathogens and viruses and things? Okay, what intrinsic issues are there? Now, you're probably not going to remember that slide that I showed you, but I talked a little bit about the qualities of the produce. So is it acidic? Is it non-acidic? What makes it what it is in terms of its makeup? Like, not what's happening external, that's the extrinsic factors that we talk about, packaging and everything that touches it, but what is it in and of itself? So if I was to ask you, well, does anyone know the answer yet before I try and reframe this? Yeah? That's very true. That is definitely one of the properties. I'm actually looking for an even more basic one. Would it meet the definition of a potentially hazardous food based on its water activity? Like, is it wet or is it dry inside? It's wet. So, and how about the pH? Is it acidic? Well, in fact, and let me go forward here. It is greater than 4.6. The interior of the flesh of the cantaloupe, it is a non-acidic fruit. So, in fact, there's many fruits that fit that definition. And you can see, if you remember that outbreak table, there was also a number of illnesses associated with watermelon and papaya. There are a number of fruits that if the outside of the fruit gets damaged, and any bacteria or dirt or soil gets in there, it can potentially grow because the environment is hospitable. The environment lets the bacteria grow in there. So when you're doing a risk assessment, I mean, this is exactly how we would do it. Someone would say, oh, what's in your fruit salad? We would look at the ingredients, and if it had cantaloupe or watermelon or papaya, we'd go, oh, those are way more likely than the pineapple or the lemon juice. Not that there might not be a problem with pineapple and lemon juice, but lemon is very acidic. It's very unlikely that E. coli is going to survive in that environment. Whereas cantaloupe, yes, E. coli, salmonella, listeria, that can occur. Okay. The next ones are the extrinsic issues. So the packaging, time, temperature, storage, the handling practices. I'm going to show you a slide from Jensen Brothers from that investigation from the Outbreak Museum of Bill Keene's. But what other issues, other than the one Elsie mentioned, that the skin is quite rough and it can hold lots of bacteria, what other issues would you have, say, on the field when you're harvesting the cantaloupe? Yes. Sorry. Exactly, yes, it's next to the soil, unless it's grown in Grand Forks on that black tarp. But yeah, you can have soil there. One of the issues that they found, I'm just gonna go ahead. These are the issues that you probably remember already from that cantaloupe investigation, is that when they were harvesting in the summertime, that cantaloupe was really hot and they failed to cool it down before they started the packaging. And so condensation went on the outside, and that allowed the bacteria that was there to grow even further. So these are some of the pictures that are from on this website from the Outbreak Museum. And it actually shows, when I was reading about this outbreak, all I heard was, oh, they used an old potato washer. But in fact, when they did the investigation, that might have been what caused it, but they had a number of other things that are easily controllable in operations. And one of the biggest ones they mentioned was field heat from the produce, is that, after the cantaloupe were harvested, they didn't give them enough time to cool down before they started the sorting and the rinsing and the packaging process. And that's what allowed the listeria to multiply. The other things they had to say was that all the contamination of the produce occurred downstream of the processing equipment, and it is possible that this equipment was previously contaminated. But they also had issues with transportation. They said that there was a truck that would always enter the facility that also was visiting a nearby cattle ranch. So what do cattle carry that's a problem? Yes, we all know what that is. So these are things that you need to think about in your operation. Try and think from a risk assessment perspective where you can take your interventions and make your controls. So I'm going to talk a little bit about flour. This is something that I'm really concerned about as a food safety specialist at BC CDC. We haven't seen a bunch of these outbreaks before, but in the last few years, we had 2 in 2017. I think the States has had 3 in recent years. These are pictures from the recall notices that CFI put up on their website. And in 2017, related to the Ardent Mills recall, or event, I should say, there were over 19 different recalls over a 3 to 4 month period. So you can imagine that trying to trace back to all the different products, it takes a really long time. So there was, bags of general all-purpose flour. There were tart shells. There were deep dish pie shells. These are things that I buy myself. And then coincidentally, we also had Rogers flour here in BC, and this one we also issued a public advisory for. So there were illnesses related to these. And so why is flour a problem? Why is E. coli getting into flour? Where does E. coli come from? It comes from poop. And even children know this. E. coli is a poo bacteria. I love this picture that someone drew of this. It must have been a kid. So somehow E. coli is getting into that flour. How? And this is really what you need to think about on your operations, is how can I prevent how can I prevent E. coli from getting into my product or on my product or touching my product, being involved in the transport chain? I think it involves a lot of good agricultural practices. I think this is a sanitation issue in the final analysis. So the outbreak investigation itself, it really focused on the mill and all of the incoming different kinds of grains. There were 3 or 4 different kind of hoppers where they put things in, and they had different blends. There was a lot of trace back at the mill. But a root cause analysis of this outbreak was actually never conducted. And that's why I think it's really important to think about, well, how did that E. coli get onto the flour and into the mill? And so for me, my actual area of specialty is fish and shellfish. And I think there's a lot of parallels here with issues with sewage contamination, because that's what we're talking about, right? We're talking about how is the poo getting onto the flour. And I'm going to just show you what we did to try and educate the public in this next slide. This was an infographic. This was the first time I ever tried to make an infographic on something. And what I've got on the upper left-hand corner there is the wheat, and then all of the things that might be affecting the wheat. You've got insects, you've got rodents, you've got cattle, you've got birds, and you've got wild animals. So what's going on in your farm? What kind of measures have you got to have a look at what's going on there? Is there any way you can eat? The problem is if you've got grain, you've got mice. But are there any measures you can take to limit that? Whenever I look at this picture, I have to smile, because when I first did it, of course, I gave it to my colleagues and said, well, what do you think? And the truck used to be red. And he was from Saskatchewan. He's retired now. And he said, no, Lorraine, the truck has to be green. If it's not John Deere, it's not a tractor. So whenever I look at this, I think of the color of the tractor. Anyways. Somehow we have this contamination. It could be rodents in the silo, but I actually think it happened on the field. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about sewage, but then I'm going to actually suggest that it could be climate change. So one of the big things, of course, is your septic sources in the field. And you mentioned the Shigella outbreak, and that was in 2001, and I was in the lab at that time, and I tested a lot of spinach, and we never found the Shigella on the spinach. It's really hard to find bacteria on food, but there were a number of illnesses, and we did figure that it was the water and the irrigation, and perhaps even the washing practices. So irrigation ditch water was used to clean the spinach. That wasn't a good idea. So you want to make sure that you're using potable water when you're doing any rinsing. But another thing you want to do is limit the animals that have access to the water that you use to irrigate your crops. I mean, this is something really basic. You want to make sure that any manure that's put on your field is properly composted. And you also, if you have neighbors, you want to make sure that there's no runoff. So Walkerton, everyone's heard of Walkerton. That was 20 years ago now. There's still people living with hemolytic uremic syndrome from having an E. coli, a 157H7 illness. These things, that was preventable. What have you got in your operation? That's preventable. We know that sewage can really impact a drinking water supply. Another thing that cattle, they carry cryptosporidium that can also be really damaging. But I'm recalling what you said about cyclospora. I'm not usually allowed to say this, but we don't have cyclospora in BC. So whenever we get these cyclospora outbreaks, I'm like, oh, what's the imported food now? I don't know if that'll change with climate change in the future, but if someone is saying, oh, we have some problems with raspberries and cyclospora, they're probably not anything that's grown here in BC. It's almost always imported or mixed. So domestic and imported ingredients are mixed. So I'm kind of getting off track here, but okay. Rodents are the other one that I mentioned besides cattle. They can be an issue in the field. They can be an issue in those silos that were on that slide. And they carry E. coli, they carry all kinds of things. They're a warm-blooded mammal, but they can also get ground into things. And at the bottom there is the acceptance sampling plan parameter. That's what Health Canada puts out. That tells you just exactly how many insects or rodent hairs are allowed to be in your flour. So there are different standards for that. And when I mentioned you want to look at lab evidence, are you testing your food to see if they meet or do not meet the Health Canada standards? And aren't you thrilled now, anyone who bakes, to know that you might have insects or, mouse poo in your in your flour. So anyways, I just want to put that out there. Think about it. And then the picture that I have of the mouse, there's a guy, Dr. Gerhard Gries. And have you ever heard of him? He's at SFU. He's like the rat and mouse guru. He's been creating new food bait traps for mice or rats. And he's an excellent presenter. And if you haven't looked into his work yet, I think you should. He's a very interesting person, and it's very exciting, the work that he's doing. And I think he might have solutions for properly baiting mice and rats. The mice are herbivores and rats are omnivores, and finding you solutions. Okay, so this is really why I'm interested in flower outbreaks. It seems very strange to me that in 2017 we had 2 flower outbreaks, but entirely different biotypes. So even though they were both E. coli 121, they were different species altogether. So what else was going on? I think, or I suppose, when we're looking at climate trends, the year before this occurred in 2016, where I've got the arrow, it's not entirely clear from this chart. I just pulled it off the web, but we had the highest amount of rainfall the previous fall that year. So if there was fecal material, if there was feces or something in the fields, it's quite likely that with the runoff, the wheat got contaminated somehow. Or, there was a lot of mud maybe on the tire truck treads. I mean, there's many things that might have happened, but this is something that we want to evaluate. And in your risk management activities, I think this is a popular topic these days, but how are you managing climate change? So how are you managing excess rainfall or excess heat in your operations? I think it's something that needs to be considered. So this is how I think the contamination might have gotten into the flour. But then there's also the old-fashioned way, and I got this picture from a health inspector. I know it's not super clear, but that's a mouse who's chewed his way through the edge of a bag of flour, and then suffocated. So clearly this particular food premises has an issue with mice. So this is all basic kind of sanitation and good agricultural practices, but it's important. The last one I wanted to cover was insects. So this is a picture of a common housefly, Musca domestica. Do you know that they can carry up to 1 million bacteria on their body? That's a lot of bacteria. Mostly it's in the gut, but they can carry it on their feet and their hairs. They also regurgitate their food in order to eat it. So they're yakking up bacteria onto whatever surface they're at. Now, I know on a farm you're not going to be able to get rid of flies, but you want to make sure that you don't have any sources around that are easy for them to get at. So if you have a lot of garbage or food sources for them to eat, it's just going to multiply your problem. If you're operating in a greenhouse, have you got your screens up, right? These are things that you can have some partial control over. You want to make sure that you limit their ability to get into your facility. In optimal conditions, these little guys can hatch within 24 hours of being laid. It's kind of scary. So transportation. I'm not sure where this picture of the watermelons came from in the back of someone's truck, but this isn't really the way you want to see your melons being transported around. You were mentioning, what does your food touch? Well, who knows what's going on in the back of that yellow station wagon. You want to make sure that your food is handled properly. You do need employee sanitation, but you also need basic sanitation. These should be in boxes. As soon as you take your produce off the field, you want to cool it down, put a tarp over it, something to keep it cool. You want to use the proper vehicle. You want to use the proper equipment. You want to make sure that, animals, whatever they might be in your operation, are not cross-contaminating your vegetables and your produce. And that, I think, is the end for me. And I'll hand it over to the next speaker. Thank you.